We are aware of a ransom letter that was sent to the local media and then to national outlets. As with every lead, we are taking it seriously.
They told you it was a kidnapping. $6 million in Bitcoin, a hard deadline, an 84-year-old woman's life on the line, ransom notes, and not one but two blasted out to newsrooms across the country. TMZ got one. Local Arizona stations got one. Major national networks got one. Every single outlet received the exact same demand, the exact same deadline, the exact same story. And for 32 days, the entire country swallowed it whole. Law enforcement believed it. The FBI mobilized some of its most experienced agents and set up a forward command post in Tucson, Arizona. The Pima County Sheriff held press conference after press conference telling the public he personally believed this woman was still alive. Search and rescue teams swept the Sonoran Desert. Volunteer groups drove in from neighboring state, Llanos. A Mexican missing persons organization crossed the border specifically to help. $1 million reward was announced, then raised, then made payable in cash, anonymously, to remove every possible barrier for anyone who knew something but was afraid to speak. Every single lead went cold. Both deadlines passed. No exchange, no response, no third note, nothing. But here is what this true crime documentary is going to walk you through slowly, carefully, point by point, using only confirmed evidence and on-record statements from people whose entire professional credibility depends on accuracy. The kidnapping story was never real. It was a cover. And what it was built to conceal is something the people responsible have been counting on one thing to protect them. That nobody would say it plainly. We are saying it today. 5 pieces of evidence. 1 conclusion. A theory constructed entirely from verified facts that have been sitting in plain sight for over a month, waiting for someone to line them up. When you see what those 5 pieces actually show, and what they reveal when placed side by side, you will not look at this case the same way again. Let's establish what we actually know, not what we've been told, not the official theory, not the narrative that was constructed over 33 days through press conferences, tip lines, and reward announcements. What we can verify from confirmed evidence and on-record statements from people whose professional credibility is staked on getting it right. January 31st, 2026. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, takes an Uber from her home to a family member's house in Tucson, Arizona for dinner. She eats, she laughs. She is dropped back off at her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood at 9:48 in the evening. Her garage door closes at 9:50 p.m. She is inside. She is alive. By every indication, she is going to bed in the same home she has lived in for years. That is the last normal moment on record. Then the timestamps begin. At 1:47 a.m., the Google Nest doorbell camera at the front of her home is disconnected. Not shut off remotely. Disconnected in a way that suggests it was physically interfered with at the device level. At 2:12 a.m., a motion sensor on a separate camera detects a person on the property. No video captured. Because Nancy did not have an active recording subscription. At 2:28 a.m., the single most significant timestamp in this entire case, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker disconnects from her cell phone. The cardiac device that had been monitoring her heart rhythm, syncing with her phone, maintaining her medical baseline, goes completely dark. 3 timestamps, 41 minutes. Something happened inside that window. The next morning, February 1st, Nancy does not appear for an online church service she had planned to attend with a close friend. The friend tries to reach her. No answer. A family member drives to the house. The doors are locked. Nancy's phone is inside. Her purse is inside. Her personal belongings, everything an 84-year-old woman would take if she chose to go somewhere, are all still. There, she is not. Law enforcement is called. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos arrives. The scene is immediately declared a crime scene. Nanos looks at the evidence, the blood near the front door, the locked house, the belongings left behind, the disabled camera, and states clearly that he believes Nancy Guthrie was abducted against her will. The FBI joins within hours. Federal resources, federal database access, federal forensic capacity, all mobilized for a kidnapping case in suburban Tucson. Then the ransom notes arrive. Multiple news outlets, starting with a local Arizona station, then TMZ, report receiving ransom communications demanding $6 million in Bitcoin, with a deadline of February 9th, 8 days out. The notes include 2 details that law enforcement had not yet made public. Nancy's Apple Watch, and a specific floodlight at her home.
We are aware of a ransom letter that was sent to the local media and then to national outlets. As with every lead, we are taking it seriously.
The FBI's Phoenix division confirmed publicly that the Bureau is treating the notes as credible and actively investigating their authenticity. And right there, that is where the official narrative locked into place like concrete. Kidnapping for ransom. From that moment forward, every press conference, every cable news segment, every expert panel operated inside that frame. The question that everyone kept asking was, who has Nancy Guthrie? Where is she being held? And how do we get her back? Those were the wrong questions, because the kidnapping narrative, as we are about to prove, piece by confirmed piece, has never fit the evidence, not from day one. And the professionals who have spent their entire careers inside exactly this type of crime have been saying so, in careful and measured language, since the very first week. 5 pieces of evidence. Let's go through each one. And let's start with the ransom notes, because when you stop accepting them at face value and actually analyze them as evidence, they become the first and most critical indicator that this was never a kidnapping for financial gain. Multiple ransom notes arrived in the days following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. $6 million in Bitcoin, a deadline of February 9th. Specific insider details, the Apple Watch, the floodlight, that gave the impression of someone who had actually been inside that home. And the notes were well written, coherent, structured, not the frantic misspelled scrawl of a panicked criminal, but something far more deliberate. One media figure described the grammar as perfect, and they were sent to TMZ, to a local Arizona television newsroom, to journalists, not to the Guthrie family, not to law enforcement, not to anyone with the authority, the access, or the resources to authorize a $6 million Bitcoin transfer. Stop right there, because in the wall-to-wall coverage of this true crime case, that single detail has been mentioned briefly and then moved past, as though it were a minor procedural oddity rather than the fundamental contradiction it actually is. Think about what a ransom demand is at its core. It is a negotiation instrument. You hold something of value. You contact the people who want that thing back. You state your price. You wait. You negotiate. That is the architecture of every ransom situation in the history of organized crime, from the Lindbergh kidnapping to modern cartel operations to corporate hostage situations overseas. The communication always goes to the people with the money. Always. Without that communication, there is no leverage. Without leverage, there is no transaction. Without a transaction, there is no point to the kidnapping. You do not send a ransom note to TMZ. You do not send a $6 million demand to a newsroom where it will be immediately photographed, published online, forwarded to the FBI, and broadcast across every screen in America within hours. That is not a ransom demand. That is a press release. That is a document designed not to start a private negotiation, but to create a very specific, very public story. And Heath Janklow, the FBI's special agent in charge overseeing this investigation, said something publicly that should have commanded far more attention than it received. He confirmed that the ransom note contained no means whatsoever for the family to contact the sender. There was a Bitcoin address where money could theoretically be deposited. No phone number, no email, no instruction for how the Guthrie family could respond, reach out, or initiate any form of communication with whoever claimed to be holding their mother. Janklow confirmed there had been zero contact with the Guthrie family since the notes were sent to media, and he stated carefully but clearly that this was unusual in kidnapping cases, and that there would normally be contact by this point. The special agent in charge of the FBI's involvement in this case is publicly flagging that the core mechanic of the entire kidnapping theory is not behaving like a real kidnapping. Then there is retired FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing, 25 years in the Denver field office working exactly these kinds of cases. His assessment has been consistent and unambiguous from day one. The kidnap for ransom theory does not add up because the alleged kidnappers never reached out to the Guthrie family directly. In his professional experience, when criminals take someone for money, they contact the family immediately. There is urgency. There is rapid back and forth. There are proof of life requests, both sides beginning the negotiation that determines the outcome. That contact begins within hours, not days. And it goes to the family, not to a cable news network. None of that happened here. 2 notes, both sent to media, both setting deadlines, and then absolute silence. When the first deadline passed, nothing. And when February 9th arrived, nothing. No third note, No escalation, no consequences, no indication that whoever sent those notes was paying any attention to whether the deadline had been met at all. In a real ransom kidnapping, a missed deadline triggers a response. The captor asserts consequences. They communicate something, because the entire structure of their leverage depends on the threat remaining credible. When 2 deadlines pass and the alleged captor goes completely silent, it means one of 2 things. Either the kidnapper panicked and walked away, or the deadline was never real to begin with. Given 2 deadlines, both passed in total silence, the second explanation is the one that fits. The notes were not the communication of a kidnapper waiting for payment. They were the communication of someone constructing a story. And if that is true, then the question is no longer who has Nancy Guthrie and when will they release her. The question is what actually happened at that front door, and why was an entire kidnapping narrative built on top of it. Before we get to what actually happened at that front door, we need to establish one more pillar of the ransom theory's complete collapse. Because the family asked, the FBI asked, the entire country was watching and waiting. And in 32 days of an alleged kidnapping in progress, nobody ever proved that Nancy Guthrie was alive. On February 4th, 2026, 3 days after Nancy was reported missing, Savannah Guthrie stood in front of a camera with her 2 siblings.
We live in a world where voices and images are easily manipulated. We need to know, without a doubt, that she is alive.
This is a national news anchor, a woman who had been briefed directly and continuously by the FBI agents running this investigation. She had access to law enforcement at the highest levels. The most sophisticated and investigative resources in the country were actively deployed on behalf of her mother, and 3 days in, she could not confirm whether her mother was alive, because nobody had told her, because nobody had shown her, because whoever allegedly had Nancy Guthrie never provided a single piece of evidence that she existed anywhere in their custody. Not a phone call, not a recorded message, not a photograph, not a video, not a handwritten note referencing something only Nancy would know, not even a third-party intermediary passing along basic information. 2 ransom notes, a $6 million demand, an 8-day deadline, and in the entire duration of that supposed kidnapping, not one proof of life. Understand what that means operationally. In any legitimate ransom kidnapping, proof of life is not a courtesy. It is the foundation of the entire enterprise. Without it, the leverage disappears entirely. The family cannot negotiate in good faith for someone they cannot confirm is alive. Law enforcement cannot justify authorizing a payment. No financial institution, no Bitcoin transfer mechanism, no pathway for moving $6 million operates without some verification that the transaction has a legitimate purpose. Proof of life is not an extra step. It is the prerequisite for every step that follows. Retired FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing analyzed the ransom communications in detail and identified something critical. The person or persons who sent those emails to media outlets appeared to be an entirely separate operation from the masked individual seen on the doorbell camera footage. The lone armed figure at Nancy's front door and the person who drafted those notes and sent them to newsrooms, Grusing's read was that these did not appear to be the same operational entity working in coordination. The emails had no mechanism for the family to respond, no channel for anything resembling an actual kidnapping negotiation. Now layer in the medical reality, because this is where the evidence stops being suspicious and starts becoming definitive. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly from the very first week that she was dependent on daily medication for a serious heart condition. Without that medication, he said her life could be at risk within 24 hours. This was not a vague concern. It was specific. It was confirmed by her medical history, and Nanos treated it as the most immediate life-threatening variable in the entire investigation. He contacted local pharmacies. He made direct public appeals to anyone holding Nancy, asking them to ensure she received her medicine. 24 hours. That was the window. She was taken in the early hours of February 1st. If she was alive and in someone's custody, whoever held her needed to obtain her specific prescription cardiac medication by February 2nd at the absolute latest, and continue providing it every single day for the entire duration of any captivity. Now examine the ransom notes against that reality. Did either note acknowledge her medical condition? No. Did either note offer any assurance she was receiving her medication? No. Did any communication through any channel suggests that whoever claimed to hold Nancy Guthrie had any awareness of her cardiac needs whatsoever. No. The same people who allegedly did enough research to include insider details like Nancy's Apple Watch and the floodlight at her home, those same people had no plan for keeping their victim alive past the first day. They didn't mention the medication. They didn't acknowledge the 24-hour window. They set a deadline of February 9th. 8 days out, for a woman who without her daily cardiac medication would likely not survive more than 48 hours. The math has never worked. And Michael Gould, a former Nassau County Police lieutenant, founder of the NYPD's K-9 unit, and a professional with deep experience in missing persons cases, applied that math and reached a conclusion that the mainstream true crime coverage never gave the weight it deserved. Based on Nancy's age, her medication dependency, the physical evidence of trauma at the crew scene, and the complete absence of any proof she was alive and receiving care, Gould assessed that she most likely passed away within the first 72 hours of her disappearance. 72 hours from the early morning of February 1st is February 4th, 5 days before the ransom deadline. His estimate was not emotional. It was a clinical application of what is medically known about elderly cardiac patients, medication dependency, physical trauma, and the physiological limits of survival under the described circumstances. And if Gould is right, if Nancy Guthrie was already gone by February 4th, then here is what February 9th actually was. It was a deadline set by someone who knew she was already gone. A date chosen specifically to create the appearance of an active, ongoing kidnapping situation during the period when the investigation was still in its earliest stages, designed to absorb law enforcement resources into a hostage rescue scenario that had no hostage, designed to keep the media focused on a transaction that was never going to happen, designed to delay the moment when investigators would stop asking where is she, and start asking what actually happened inside that house. And when February 9th arrived and passed in total silence, no follow-up note, no new demand, no escalation of any kind, that silence was not the silence of a frightened kidnapper backing down. It was the silence of someone who had no more use for the kidnapping story. The narrative had served its purpose. The investigation had been redirected, and the real question, what happened in that house and why, was still buried under the wreckage of a Bitcoin ransom that was never going to be collected. Now we go back to the beginning. Back to the moment where CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst John Miller said something that should have stopped this entire narrative cold. His exact words were these: whatever type of crime this started as, things began to go wrong very quickly. He was not talking about the investigation. He was not commenting on law enforcement's response or the FBI's management of the case. He was talking about what happened at Nancy Guthrie's front door in the earliest hours of February 1st, 2026. And his primary piece of evidence for that assessment was the blood. Forensic investigators found blood at or near the entrance of Nancy Guthrie's home. Law enforcement confirmed it was present on her front porch at and near the entry point of her house. Subsequent DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie, her blood, outside her front door. Now think about what that means inside the kidnapping theory. If your operational goal is financial, if you've taken an elderly woman for ransom and your entire plan depends on keeping her alive long enough to collect $6 million, then blood at the point of entry is a catastrophic failure. You need the victim to survive transport. You need her physically stable. A violent confrontation at the front door that produces bloodshed is the opposite of a controlled operation. It creates visible evidence. It risks alerting neighbors. It generates exactly the kind of physical trace that forensic investigators will spend weeks processing. Any competent planner of a ransom kidnapping designs the extraction specifically to avoid this. And yet, blood at the front door before she was ever moved anywhere. John Miller's framing carries a precise implication. It implies there was a plan, and the plan changed. That whoever came to that door had an intention, and something at the moment of contact with Nancy caused that intention to be overtaken by violence that was never part of the original design. Something reactive. Something that happened faster than the plan anticipated. And this is where the evidence becomes even more disconnected from the kidnapping theory. For weeks, law enforcement would not confirm whether there had been forced entry at the residence. Sheriff Nanos and his department declined to answer directly whether any doors, windows, or locks had been compromised. A criminal attorney analyzing the case publicly noted that this reluctance The refusal to answer a basic factual question about how the perpetrator entered the home suggested something out of the ordinary about the method of entry. Because if it were standard forced entry, there would be no particular reason to withhold that information. Consider the implication. Blood on the porch, but no confirmed forced entry. If no door was kicked in, no window was broken, no lock was picked, then someone opened that door. Either it was already unlocked or someone on the inside opened it for them. Retired FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing offered a careful but significant read on this, looking at the doorbell camera footage, the masked figure covering the lens with a gloved hand, then using foliage to obscure it further. Grusing asked a question that cut straight to the heart of this case. He said, "Is it possible the suspect was pressing the doorbell or knocking, trying to get Nancy to answer, and covering himself from the camera so she would not see a masked person and would open the door out of confusion?" He added, "If that was the case, the suspect was probably not primarily there to rob the home. Think through that scenario carefully. Someone at 2 o'clock in the morning knocking at Nancy Guthrie's door. Nancy, 84 years old, likely groggy, likely disoriented, opening the door to someone she could not see clearly because the camera was already covered. And at that moment, blood on the porch." Former FBI and CIA officer Tracy Walder addressed the targeting directly, and her language matters. She said this was too targeted. This is not a house you just come upon and decide to rob. It is just not that. The Catalina foothills is a sprawling residential area with dozens of comparable properties. Coming to this specific house at this specific hour with this specific level of preparation, mask, gloves, awareness of the doorbell camera, is not random. It is the result of prior knowledge, prior surveillance, prior planning that chose this house, this woman, this night. Former FBI Special Agent Greg Rogers built directly on that. He told Parade magazine, "I've never thought this was a robbery gone wrong." His reasoning is precise. Professional burglars case properties. They learn when owners are away. They enter homes specifically when residents are not present, because a person inside turns a property crime into a violent crime, dramatically increasing both risk and legal consequences. A seasoned burglar does not enter a home at 2 a.m. when an 84-year-old woman is almost certainly inside. Rogers also pointed out there has been no confirmed report of anything being taken from Nancy Guthrie's home. No missing jewelry, no missing electronics, no missing cash. If this were a robbery, even one that escalated into something worse, there would be missing valuables.
Here, it's just too targeted, Brian. This is too, you've been there for such a long time. Like, this is not a house that you just come upon and decide to rob. It's just not that.
She said it's just too targeted. This is not a house you just come upon and decide to rob. It's just not that. The Catalina foothills is a sprawling residential area with many properties. Coming to the specific house at the specific time with this specific level of preparation and mask, gloves, backpack, awareness of the doorbell camera is not random. It is the result of prior knowledge, prior surveillance, prior planning that chose this house, this woman, this night. Nothing has been identified as stolen. Whoever entered that home was either not there for valuables, or the theft was entirely secondary to whatever their primary objective actually was. Not a robbery, not a random home invasion, not an opportunistic crime. Something specific, something planned, something that brought a masked, armed individual to that exact door at that exact hour. And then something went catastrophically wrong at the moment of contact. Now let's talk about what happened after that front door. Because 40 minutes is not a kidnapping timeline. The confirmed timeline breaks down like this. The doorbell camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m. The motion sensor detected a person at 2:12 a.m. The pacemaker disconnected from Nancy's phone at 2:28 a.m. That window then from the doorbell going dark to the pacemaker going dark is 41 minutes. Former FBI supervisory special agent and behavioral profiler Jim Clemente, who built his entire career specializing in abductions and violent crimes, identified that window as one of the most analytically significant pieces of evidence in this entire case. He said directly, "The suspect spent approximately 40 minutes in that home, and that is a very long time for a simple targeted kidnapping." He added that the extended time inside increased the perpetrator's exposure significantly. Here is why that matters. If your objective is a ransom kidnapping, if you are there to take a specific person and hold them at another location until a financial demand is met, then speed is your most fundamental operational requirement. Every additional minute at the scene, Is a minute during which a neighbor could look out a window, a passing car could note your vehicle, a security system you missed could be recording. Your biological trace evidence is compounding, professional abductors. Understand this at a foundational level. A clean extraction is fast. Minutes at the scene, not 40. Clemente also noted the suspect showed multiple markers of someone who was not a professional. He was unprepared for the doorbell camera. His response was entirely improvised, first using his gloved hand and then grabbing foliage, neither of which is a planned countermeasure. He had no visible tools for a prepared forced entry. And critically, he wore no mouth covering. Clemente noted that we shed D-endonine through breath constantly. Every minute that suspect spent inside that home, he was depositing biological trace evidence that could eventually identify him. 40 minutes of unmasked breathing inside a crime scene. So what was he doing for 40 minutes? 40 minutes is not a timeline for removing one 84-year-old woman from a house. Even under difficult circumstances, the physical act of moving a person from their bedroom to a waiting vehicle is not a 40-minute operation. Whatever filled those 40 minutes was not simply an extraction. 40 minutes is, however, a timeline for a search. That is enough time to go through every room systematically, to open filing cabinets, to check drawers across multiple pieces of furniture, to review paperwork and personal documents, to access a computer or tablet, to look through a personal safe or a lockbox, to search deliberately and with focus for something specific, something that requires looking through materials rather than simply grabbing a visible item. Former FBI Special Agent Greg Rogers offered the most important interpretive framework for that 40-minute question. He told Parade that he believes it's highly likely that someone who knew Nancy, or who had knowledge of her life through a service relationship, home maintenance, healthcare, yard work, deliveries, any role that gave access to her schedule, her home layout, her daily routines, was involved. That person could have provided information about her security systems, her vulnerabilities, where things were kept inside that house. Someone who came with a purpose that went far beyond simply taking an elderly woman for ransom. Because if ransom were the only goal, 40 minutes inside that home would be 40 minutes of unnecessary and catastrophic risk that no rational criminal would take. Grusing added his own read, the suspect may have had a personal grievance against Nancy. Something personal, some conflict or history or relationship that brought him to that door. And Nancy may have recognized him at the moment she opened it. That recognition, that split second of identification, may have been precisely what caused the situation to escalate before it could be controlled, which would explain both the blood at the entry point and the chaotic, unplanned nature of everything that followed. The FBI has never publicly confirmed that Nancy Guthrie left that home alive. The investigation has proceeded on the assumption of abduction, and that may ultimately prove correct. But the blood, the 40 minutes, the absence of forced entry, and the covered camera all tell the same story when read together. Whatever happened inside that home was not a clean, fast, professional kidnapping. It was a protracted, unplanned, escalating sequence of events managed by someone handling a situation that had gone badly wrong from the moment that front door opened. And all of it, every piece of it, points away from the kidnapping narrative that was handed to the public on day one, and towards something that the people responsible have worked very deliberately to keep buried. 5 pieces of evidence. Let's put them all on the table one final time. Ransom notes sent to media outlets, not to the family who had the money and the motive to pay. No proof of life across 32 days of an alleged captivity in progress. Her blood on the front porch before she was ever moved anywhere. 40 minutes inside. A timeline of a search or an improvised crisis, not a professional abduction. And a medication window that closed by February 4th, 5 days before the ransom deadline even arrived. One conclusion. This was never a kidnapping. So if it was never a kidnapping, what was it? Let's build the answer from the ground up, not from rumor, not from anonymous sources, not from speculation, from confirmed evidence and verified on-record analysis from people who have spent their entire professional lives inside exactly this type of case. Someone came to Nancy Guthrie's home that night with a plan, a specific plan, targeted enough to know which house, prepared enough to arrive masked, gloved, and aware of the doorbell camera, connected enough to have prior knowledge of her schedule, her home layout, and possibly her security setup. Former FBI and CI officer Tracy Walder said it plainly. This is not a house you just come upon and decide to rob. It is just not that. former FBI special agent. Greg Rogers said he has never believed this was a robbery gone wrong. Former FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing raised the possibility that Nancy may have recognized the person at her door the moment she opened it, and that recognition may have been the precise trigger that caused the entire situation to violently unravel before it could be contained. That would explain the blood. That would explain the 40 minutes. That would explain why no forced entry was ever confirmed. And that would explain why the ransom notes were constructed and sent to newsrooms within days, not as a genuine financial demand, but as a cover story. A document designed to redirect an entire national investigation away from the real question. Not who has Nancy Guthrie, but who came to her door that night, what were they looking for, and what happened when she opened it. John Miller, CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst, former deputy commissioner of the NYPD, a man who has spent his career reading the gap between what a crime appears to be and what it actually is, said whatever type of crime this started as, things began to go wrong very quickly. He was not speaking casually. He was describing a plan that collapsed at the moment of contact. A plan that generated blood on a front porch in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona at roughly 2 o'clock in the morning. And then required a cover story, sophisticated enough to redirect the FBI, the national media, and the entire American public for 33 days and counting. The ransom notes were that cover story, and they worked. Until you line up the evidence and look at all 5 pieces together, then they stop working entirely. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 33 days as of this recording. The investigation remains active. DNA recovered from inside her home, a mixed sample containing material from more than one person, is still being processed at a private laboratory in Florida. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the Catalina foothills neighborhood on the night of February 1st are still under active review. The suspect captured on that doorbell camera has identifiable features. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffendafer has called him the single most actionable lead in the entire case, citing his visible eyebrows, his mustache, and a pinky ring he was wearing on his hand. Someone watching this right now knows who that man is. Someone knows what happened inside that house during those 40 minutes. Someone has been sitting on that information. And this true crime documentary exists in part because that person needs to understand that the investigation is not going away. The Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI have both stated publicly that this remains an active, ongoing investigation, and that they will continue until Nancy is located or every available lead is exhausted. The FBI tip line is open around the clock. The family's reward stands at $1 million, payable in cash through a fully anonymous reporting channel. If you know something, if anything in this case connects to a person, a vehicle, a conversation, a detail you have been turning over in your mind, submit it. The FBI has stated publicly that some people with relevant information have been hesitant to come forward out of concern for their own privacy in a high-profile case. Those tips can be submitted completely anonymously. What this documentary has asked you to carry from the very beginning is the gap. The gap between the story the public was handed and the evidence that was actually there. Between ransom notes sent to newsrooms and the FBI official who said that was unusual and there would normally be contact by now. Between a $6 million Bitcoin deadline and a medication window that likely closed 5 days before that deadline arrived. Between the blood on the porch and the 40 minutes that no professional kidnapper would ever spend at a crime scene. Between the kidnapping narrative and every credentialed expert who looked at the evidence and said, in careful, measured, professional language, this does not fit. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was a mother and a grandmother. She was a woman of faith who had dinner with her family on a Saturday night in Tucson, Arizona, and simply never made it to church the next morning. She had a life. She had a home. She had a front porch where something happened that the people responsible have worked very deliberately to obscure. She deserves the truth, not the cover story they built on top of it.